Oh, okay. In closing government, we have NLFIUA. Woo!
I'm sure speaking first. EOA.
Isha speaking second.
Thank you. And in closing opposition, we have UK Debating Society B. Same issue. Okay, awesome. My name is Rebecca. I prefer she or they, and with me on the panel are Sam, Duncan, Mohammed, and Stuart. And without any further ado, I guess it's the motion. The motion for the House is this House believes that countries close to conflict zones should only grant long-term asylum to refugees who agree to 1 year of military service. And it gives me great pleasure to call upon the Prime Minister here.
The Turkish military is absolutely stretched to the limit in the border it sits at right now. Millions upon millions of people are fleeing from Aleppo and the cities of Syria, and the Turkish military lacks the capacity or power to police their borders. That puts Turkish civilians in lives, it risks those borders. In the Congo, the genocide of the Hutus and the Tutsis has almost been worse than it ever was in Rwanda, because thousands and thousands of people fled from Rwanda into the Congo on refugee status, and the Congolese military has no capacity to police those groups that exist on its borders that continue the genocide of Hutus and Tutsis today. To be clear in this debate, 9 times out of 10, the state that you flee into is not actively participating in the conflict you are fleeing on. So most of the time in this debate, what you will be doing is fleeing into a country whose infrastructure you want to use, a country whose military you are pushing to the brink, and a country whose military you are making struggle, and you will form part of that military for the year. I'm actually going to give you a bunch of reasons why people will be much more likely to stay with the military for much, much longer, because we think realistically joining the Turkish military is a great opportunity for many Syrian refugees, and is a life much better lived than they otherwise would have had. We think most of this debate does not consist of you joining a military that goes and actively gets back re-involved in that conflict. But I will explain why even when it does, we think this is good in those cases. So first, on principle, let's start with something very people did not create the situation as it exists in Syria. The people in Congo were not the reason that the Rwandan genocide happened, and yet right now, due to a lack of military infrastructure, those are the people who are suffering. I also understand that it is fair to say the refugees who are fleeing those countries probably also not the people who are complicit in those struggles. First thing to say that is not universally true. Some people fleeing the Congo should be forced to work for the things they do. But the second thing is to say, even if it's true, we have to be comparative here. We think the Syrian people, when they are moving into the state of the Turkey and demanding that they give them refugee status, owe something back to that nation. That is not to say that the Turkish government shouldn't also consider their humanitarian rights, but realistically, the Turkish government demands of many of its citizens that it joins the military. We don't see why, given these people are choosing to flee to Turkey, they should be treated any differently in that regard. And in fact, we think they have more obligation in this regard to join that state. But the next thing that's important to note, there are thousands of people leaving Syria. The military of Turkey cannot do its job. That problem is bad for everyone. It is bad for refugees who are fleeing because they cannot be processed at borders. They have to exist in camps where rape culture is prolific. They have to exist in a world that suffers due to purely nothing else than lack of available people to police or control those situations. So why do we think they'll be good at policing or controlling these situations? To be clear, so far the Turkish military has done a pretty good job at dealing with what it can. The Turkish military is quite adept at dealing with refugees. They obviously have a huge incentive to train the people who come across the border to a sufficient level to effectively police those borders and to be a useful asset. It would be really weird to force someone into the military for a year and not provide them with the skills and training necessary to do their job. All of that is to say that these people do undeniably owe some level of obligation to the state that they are moving into. But what about if they are forced to go back in and join the conflict? Well, in those instances, right, in the instance that you are fleeing to a country that is actively participating in that conflict, the reason you flee to that country is only because you agree with them, right? So in conflicts in Africa, the reason, and I'll take you at the end.
How likely is it to think that Turkey takes Kurdish rebels or Kurdish minority people under the model?
Well, I think it's more likely knowing that the Kurdish will be at least some level of use. To be clear, Turkish people don't take Kurdish refugees under your model either. They don't want to do that thing. It's much more likely, I'll get to this, that they would be more likely to do that when the Kurdish military force, which is an amazing military force, offers them something really useful in return. That's much more likely. If they are fleeing to join into a state that's likely to send them back into conflict, the reason they are doing so is because they agree with the conflict the state will send them back into. And we think that's actually better on that side of the house. Something that would be really obvious to us if you were like a rebel group that started to lose and then you retreated back into a country that offered you a year's military training and then sent you back into that conflict, you are A, much more likely to become a long-run rebel group that destroys that conflict or makes things worse, but B, you're a much better fighting force. Secondly, why this is better for refugees. 4 reasons. 1, countries are much more likely to take more refugees under this. One of the obvious reasons countries don't take refugees is constraints on processing, is constraints on those things. When you have a larger military force at your border, you are much more likely to take it. But 2, the narrative people often sell about refugees as they are useless, they don't offer anything to our country, they drain our resources, they're unemployed. We obviously fix that problem because these refugees instantly offer something to that country. 2, they just get a job. There are people sitting in camps for days on the Turkish border with nothing to do. They cannot accrue finance, so they cannot even do things like then use that money to try to find their family who are still stuck back in Aleppo. A job is an amazing opportunity for these people, and we think they should be happy to get one. 3, they get realistic skills and training. Militaries are great places for people who come from difficult situations to find something meaningful in their life. And you obviously have a huge incentive to be trained properly, or at least get some level of training when the job you are doing is super important for the country that you are moving into, which is 4, why we think many of these people will choose to stay and remain in that military for significantly longer than 1 year. And we think that is awesome in this debate. We think one of the things this does, which is most powerful, is rapidly increase the employment rate in the long run for refugees moving into countries. 4, finally, why this makes it much more likely to be overthrow dictators and end conflicts. One of the big problems right now that many rebel groups face in countries, no thank you, is that they refuse to back down or surrender. This was massively seen in Libya, it was massively seen in Aleppo. We would much prefer a world in which people do is go, okay, we will not win this next fight. We will flee to Turkey, get military training for a year, be processed as part of that military, understand how military dynamics work, and understand how that works, and then after their year of service is over, head back into Syria to continue fighting in that conflict. We actually think that is a very likely option that many people on the ground under our model will do. But that's really important for a few reasons. The first is it encourages tactical retreat. The second is it encourages people to learn about skills and understand basic military strategy before they head back across. It also allows rebel groups to group together and coordinate in a way they couldn't before. We improve that. But the final thing is to note, even if Assad wins, many of the refugees after their military service will still eventually go back into Syria. Some of them may like Assad, some of them may not. But many of the skills that will be taught, for example, in this military called Turkey, will be skills that are undeniably just helpful in rebuilding a country, right? So even if it is true that we don't overthrow the dictator, when these people often do eventually go back to their home country, which is universal, people fleeing from Syria do want to go back, people fleeing from London want to go back, the skills they will have been taught in that military will be absolutely useful in helping to rebuild that country, because they will often do things like join the militaries of those countries, which will be really helpful with just rebuilding efforts on the ground, or just processing refugee returns in those countries. So I think this speaks what you should take away. They do owe some level of obligation. This is undeniably better for refugees. It helps us overthrow dictators and corrupt regimes in the long run. But even if it doesn't, it just helps us rebuild those regimes in a timely and useful manner. We couldn't be more proud to stand in proposition.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister very much for their speech and now call upon the Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Actually, if you don't mind, guys, I'll light off the stream, if that's okay.
I'm sorry.
He doesn't want to stream.
Doesn't stream.
Sure, given the topic.